mentioned, I am Beth Lorimer, and I work at Kairos Canada. Kairos strives to bring together peoples, Indigenous, settler, and newcomers in shared commitment for ecological justice and human rights. We work together with networks of activists in Canada, like this wonderful community supporting Wellington Water Watchers, as well as with global partners around the world and with Canadian churches. I want to begin this session in a good way by acknowledging the land where I am located. I am joining you today from so-called Toronto. This is the land of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and more recently the Mississaugas. It is land governed by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the lands and resources around the Great Lakes. It's important for me to acknowledge, as a host of a workshop exploring decolonization, that I am a settler. My paternal ancestors settled in Treaty 2 territory in the prairies, and my maternal ancestors settled in Robertson-Huron Treaty territory of Northern Ontario. I was born in the Ottawa River watershed, and I currently live in that area of Toronto between the Humber and the Don River, in the lost but not forgotten Garrison Creek watershed. I would encourage you to take a moment wherever you are right now to acknowledge in your heart the First Peoples and treaties of the land in which you inhabit. And I welcome you to share where you're joining us from in the chat. I know we did that in the opening session, but would love to see who has joined this session today. I'm not used to presenting to a group or doing a workshop in a space where I can't see my participants. These are the times that we live in. So I will be using the chat to ask questions and just to interact with all of you over the next 45 minutes. So please share openly, just so that I know you're all with me and you're here, that will be great. So I am going to put my slides into full screen, and that will mean that I lose my ability to kind of see the chat for a second. I will jump back on at different points, and away we go. So I'm just going to move some things around here. Great. So we did start this today off with some really great words by Kelsey Leonard, and I think it really was a jumping off point for this conversation that we're about to have with me today. You know, I wanted to start by saying that wherever we live, we are part of a watershed. We all have relationships with bodies of water that sustain our lives, and we are living organisms in those watersheds. And Kelsey spoke to this very clearly, that we all have that connection with water. In this particular workshop, we're gonna explore how colonialism has influenced our relationship with water, and the land, and with other humans, and we're gonna look at some ways that we can repair those relationships. You know, to me, achieving water justice, climate justice, ecological justice requires us to unlearn some of that colonial heritage that's embedded in all of us, and to learn ways of living in right relations. Depending where we are as individuals or communities on that journey of unlearning, I hope that this workshop will help us kind of keep going on that path, as much as all the elements of the rest of today will help us to do that too. I wanted to start with this quote by a theologian who teaches and writes about Indigenous and settler relations, Denise Nadeau, that the Anishinaabe way of life is centered on relationships, each of which carry responsibilities. And if people feel a relational connection to the watershed in which they live, it is easier for them to act in an embodied way upon their responsibilities. So really kind of speaking to our relationship with water and the responsibilities we have within that relationship. There, slide trouble. Okay. We all, as people here, I imagine we all understand the watershed as that catchment area, that basin, that geographic location, a geomorphological space where the water cycle plays out. And our focus in this session will be in considering the watershed as a basin of relations, where human and non-human species are interconnected, where settlers, newcomers, and First Peoples all live, where humans extract resources, where water and land sustain life, habitat, food, where there's upstream and downstream relationships that play out. These relationships, as we know, are not in great shape right now. We are facing a global pandemic, the impacts of a climate crisis, struggles for Indigenous rights and racial justice. Our relationships have been severed, and there are several factors over the century that have brought us to this place. We've turned water into a commodity. Colonialism has imposed borders over the natural boundaries of water, which has created conflict and disconnection. The land has been developed in a way that disconnects many of us from knowing and interacting with that water that sustains our life. And colonialism, racism, white supremacy, other injustices have broken down human relationships. Settlers made treaties with Indigenous peoples, and in doing so, they made relatives of one another. And when those treaties are violated, we are breaking that relational connection with other humans. So we're going to focus today on the colonialism part, and how that severed relational connections to water and our relationships with other humans. And I know there's other workshops happening today that will look at commodification of water, of resource extraction as well. So I'm just going to come back to... Go. Okay, so to start, we're first going to look at some maps. I start with maps because they're a good thing to look at critically when we speak about colonialism, and we recognize them as kind of colonial artifacts. They represent a particular way of seeing the world. And this way is primarily concerned with ownership, exclusivity, and power relations. Not all maps, but most maps that we know. And maps tend to simplify the complexities and difficult history of defining territories and nations. Many of you here know to identify yourself by your watershed or the Indigenous territory in which you inhabit. But for most people, their identity is shaped by political boundaries. And even I too shared that I live in Toronto, a municipality, a political space. We more often introduce ourselves that way as being from a particular city or a province or country, state. So I begin with this political boundary map of Canada for that reason. This is the one that we learn in our geography textbooks in elementary school, high school. There's many colored shapes, lots of straight lines. There's a few that are irregular, and some are mixed. These are all politically determined borders. And it's interesting to note that every continental province, territory, and state in Canada and the US has at least one kind of straight line border, and some only have straight lines, as we see with Saskatchewan. And I'm just going to come back to the chat. I am going to ask you what people see in this next slide. They can tell me in the chat what we're looking at in this map. This is just to make sure you all. Turtle Island. Thank you, Melanie. Yes. Can anyone gather what the different colored shapes are? Flows along natural boundaries, various nations. Yeah, I like the natural boundaries in quotes there. So yeah, these are the oceanic, there's no straight lines, that's right. These are the oceanic watersheds of Turtle Island of North America. In the kind of Canadian part of this, there are 5 oceanic watersheds where all the water from our kind of smaller local watersheds flow eventually into one of the oceans. So we have some flowing into the Pacific, the Atlantic, or north to Hudson Bay and the Arctic Ocean. And there's even a part of southern Alberta and Saskatchewan that flows south into the Missouri down towards the Gulf of Mexico. So our political boundaries or borders have been imposed on top of this natural landscape where the water flows from one point to another. And our political boundaries really bear no resemblance to this space of water and the kind of true shape of where we live. And now who can tell me what is on this map? Or what you see, even if you don't know. You can describe it. Thanks, Paul. Yes, he knows the source. Someone referred to Paul as our walking encyclopedia, and he is proving correct on that. Watercolor shapes, a lot of overlapping. Yes, thank you, Gwen. Yes, so this is a map of Indigenous territories as mapped by nativeland.ca. So that link is there if you want to explore that site. There is a lot of overlapping shapes, various sizes, and it illustrates, again, there's no resemblance to the political map that we saw in the first slide, and kind of illustrates that there is the overlapping illustrates that there's been a history of conflict, but also of treaty. Obviously, there is coexistence in this overlapping of territories. Yes, and so they're certainly not defined in the same way that the political boundaries are in that first map. So the origin of that first political map of Canada and the impact that it has on relationships between Indigenous peoples and settlers goes back to the doctrine of discovery. There were these papal bulls, which you can see there on the slide, from the 15th century that gave explorers legal and moral justification to claim land that they quote unquote discovered for their Christian monarchs. If the lands were deemed vacant, meaning if they were uninhabited by Christians, then they could be claimed. As Indigenous people were not considered Christian, the land was deemed empty or terra nullius. So this is a colonial dispossession of sovereign Indigenous nations, and it led to practices that continue through modern day laws and policies. I also wanted to share this map in that context to kind of illustrate that the land that Indigenous peoples identify with as land of their ancestors, the land which their peoples have lived on for time immemorial, can also be associated with harm, violence, and dislocation. So this is the map of the residential school system in Canada, and its legacy of trauma kind of continues on today. next going to speak to the colonial legacy in our place names. And when settlers arrived on Turtle Island and began mapping territory, many of the names for places and bodies of water were replaced with English or French names, erasing Indigenous presence from the land. In some cases, the Indigenous names were kept and anglicized, or they were replaced altogether. Indigenous place names are intricately linked with Indigenous knowledge, stories, and teaching, and they can carry valuable ecological or navigational information. The names are mnemonic devices, which means that they remind us of a place based on specific characteristics. And these names are passed down orally through society to build a common understanding of place. So the examples on this slide are names that were either anglicized or francized. We can see those characteristics of place in the kind of, when you look at the definition of the translation of the Indigenous name into English. The examples on this slide are names that were replaced altogether with colonial names. And again, we see in the Indigenous name those really important characteristics of place that actually do remind me, if I think of Cape Breton, a foggy place, and that's certainly kind of embedded in that name. I would love to hear if anyone does know the Indigenous name of a local water body where they live, or of their city, or a space that is close to them. I would love to hear it shared in the chat. So if you do know those, please share them, and we can reclaim those names, at least in this space. Yes, and thank you, Harmony. She just made a note about Orange Shirt Day on September 30th, this coming Wednesday. Please, if you don't know what that is, do look it up and participate. Ah, yes, the Kitchissippi, Ottawa River. Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Paul. River that beats like a heart. It's really great characteristic. The legacy of colonialism Canada with Indigenous peoples is rooted in the Indian Act. And the Indian Act dictates federal control over First Nations. It prohibits Indigenous self-determination, and this First Nations jurisdiction to govern themselves is really important part of achieving justice in Canada, something that must be recognized. So I wanted to kind of end on, before we get into ways to kind of decolonize, I wanted to make note of the Indian Act as a really, it really is the framework within legal framework that we are still working in that continues to kind of create injustice and difficulty in this country in achieving achieving right relations. Self-determination is in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and Kelsey did make mention of that in her keynote. The Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. They can freely determine their political status, pursue their own economic, political, and cultural development. So returning lands, waters, resources to First Nations, and kind of addressing our treaty obligations would really go a long way in ensuring that there's not only sustainable government for First Nations, but also a sustainable management of the waters and the land and of our resources. So for the rest of this presentation, I am going to speak about ways that we can decolonize. I kind of spoke to three very small ways that colonialism has been kind of embedded in our life through maps, names, and policies and legislation, like the Doctrine of Discovery and the Indian Act. And I wanted to begin kind of a conversation of decolonization with this quote by Syed Hussein, who really kind of speaks to this process in terms of our relationships. So decolonization requires a deep unlearning of those histories and geographies that we thought we knew, that we learned as children and as students, and a new understanding of who we are in relationship to the land, to the people, and the state. So, yeah, his quote says that, this requires study, it requires conversation, it is a practice. And today is kind of one step that we're all taking in that conversation and practice. I also wanted to note that decolonization, for me as a settler, is about practicing solidarity and allyship. And some might question whether I am in a position where to speak about decolonization, but I really do think it's important to that as individuals and as communities, whether we are Indigenous or settler, is to kind of take leadership in working in a good way, and I hope that I can do that here today, to not only provide some opportunity for self-education for myself, but everyone here, about the histories and lands that we reside on, and in achieving water justice. In the guardianship of our waters, there's also ways that we can do so while practicing solidarity. So to organize this work with consent and guidance of Indigenous communities, to build long-term relationships, and to be accountable, responsive, and humble. And if folks want to share other ways that they practice solidarity or allyship, please share those in the chat, and we will generate a lot of great ideas. So there are numerous ways that we can decolonize our relationship with the water and with the watershed. And I'm going to offer the following 6, and would love to see more ideas from all of you in the chat. So please share openly. The 6 that I'm going to go through today are to repudiate those racist policies and legislation, to reclaim maps and place names, Indigenous place names, to uphold and respect Indigenous rights and title, to incorporate Indigenous knowledge alongside Western science and models of governance, to amplify the voices of Indigenous water protectors and land defenders, and to reconnect with the watershed. So I'll begin with repudiating those racist policies and legislations. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognized that policies like the doctrine of discovery were racist, as they advocated superiority of peoples over other peoples. So I'll just I'll highlight that section. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada came out with 94 calls to action to kind of move Canada on a path of right relations. And 2 of those actions specifically repudiate the concept of the doctrine of discovery. So those are Acts 45 and 46, if people are interested in looking at those. The repudiation of the doctrine of discovery has started to take place. In some legal arenas, it's being done so through the recognition of Indigenous land and, Indigenous land titles. So this is the one case that I'll refer to. It's the Chilcotin Nation case dealing with Indigenous peoples' title to land. The Supreme Court addressed the doctrine of terra nullius. So they didn't exactly repudiate the doctrine of discovery here, but the court ruled that terra nullius never applied in Canada as confirmed by the Royal Proclamation. And it was deemed that there was equitable principles in the Royal Proclamation that preclude any unjust or discriminatory policies. So that was a precedent-setting case, and one to kind of keep in mind as we find kind of other legal arenas to repudiate these policies. The second is to reclaim maps and place names. Shauna Johnson here shares a great quote. She's an Indigenous communities planner who is Coast Salish from Sawat First Nation. And she says that maps that continue to ignore Indigenous presence are an exercise of colonial power, but maps can be decolonized. So I share with you this great Ojibwe map of the Great Lakes developed by Charles Lippert and Jordan Engel for the Decolonial Atlas, and encourage you to check out that site for other decolonized maps. So you may, if this map is new to you, it may be disorienting as it is oriented to the east, and this is because the Anishinaabe orient themselves to the east, as developed by the people that made this map. So you can notice the medicine wheel at the bottom has replaced the compass rose, and they've included the English word for north, as that is the way that the English speaker orients themselves, and Wabang, meaning east in Anishinaabe Moan, to kind of signal that that is the orientation, the Indigenous orientation. And the medicine wheel is used here because that is a symbol used on Turtle Island to denote the 4 directions. I'll also share this other map of kind of the Great Lakes and below. It is a Haudenosaunee map of Great Lakes and kind of the territory south of that. And it was developed by Jordan Engel as well, but with a Karienheo Delaronde, or Kanienkeha speaker. And on this map, yeah, we noticed that there are no political boundaries. And in Kanienkeha, they say they consider those borders as the tracks that were dragged by colonists. So the land of the Haudenosaunee spanned this territory before so-called Canada and so-called United States came to be, and before those tracks dragged by the colonists were made. So those are just kind of 2 examples of how maps can be reclaimed. The use of Indigenous names is also enshrined in the UN Declaration, and states need to take effective measures to protect those rights. So there is a strong movement to visibilize and verbalize Indigenous names in Canada. The Ojibwe and Haudenosaunee maps of the Great Lakes is just one example of a way to recognize Indigenous presence in the watershed, to recognize this presence that has been there for millennia, and the knowledge that has been amassed over centuries about the places in the watershed. In some places, Indigenous names are being officially recognized over colonial ones. In 2009, the BC government renamed the Queen Charlotte Islands off the north coast of British Columbia to Haida Gwaii, meaning Islands of the People. In other parts of the country, Indigenous peoples and settlers are advocating for similar name changes. I know in New Brunswick, the Maliseet people have petitioned the provincial government to recognize the St. John River with its original name, Wallastock, meaning beautiful river. In British Columbia, again, there was the Saanich First Nation erected a sign on Mount Douglas in Victoria bearing the peak's original name, which was Puckles or White Rock. And using these Indigenous names keeps the history, story, and teachings of Indigenous peoples alive and present in those spaces. The third point is to uphold and respect Indigenous rights and title. So again, this goes back to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. By the end of the year, the government has promised, recommitted in its throne speech from this week to legislate the UN Declaration. And that legislation would kind of guide a national implementation of the Declaration into our laws. The Declaration doesn't create new rights. It just affirms the pre-existing inherent human rights of Indigenous peoples, and those are necessary for kind of minimum standards of survival and well-being and dignity. The Declaration provides the basis for decolonization and upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples, including that right to self-determination and the right to free, prior, and informed consent, which is critical for decision-making about water and resources. So the right to free, prior, and informed consent, meaning that Indigenous peoples have the right to be consulted in a way that is free, that is done prior to development taking place, and that they have the right to provide their informed consent to those projects that are on Indigenous territory. The fourth point is on incorporating Indigenous knowledge alongside Western science and governance. So the UN Declaration also affirms this importance of Indigenous knowledge affirms the importance of Indigenous knowledge and culture as it relates to responsible and sustainable development. The knowledge embedded in Indigenous language kind of speaks to that, but there's also many other ways in which Indigenous knowledge is being incorporated into Western science and governance models. And I wanted to share this great example of this kind of interconnected approach from New Zealand. It's a beautiful example for water because it is based on looking at floodplains and kind of geomorphology. And Claire Wilkinson, who studied the frameworks, or who studies kind of these frameworks to integrate Indigenous knowledge with earth sciences, said this about geomorphology, that it is all about what's going on at the surface and how different parts of the landscape interact with each other. And that's so much of what Indigenous knowledge is. They're cumulative relationships with landscapes throughout generations. So there was a Maori scholar called Angus MacFarland who developed this braided rivers approach that weaves together Western science with this Maori knowledge. The framework is inspired by the South Island in New Zealand, and there is this this braided rivers system, which you can kind of see in the background image. And it consists of a network of interwoven channels that are separated by temporary islands. And we see that there's the Indigenous knowledge and Western science as separate streams that periodically meet, inform, and guide each other. And in Angus's words, ultimately those streams meet at the river mouth before they go out to sea. So I think that is just a wonderful example of how that approach can be made. And just wondering if other people also see the similarities in that approach with the wampum belt, that there is these separate streams that interact and kind of coexist, but they do together inform kind of a richer knowledge and understanding of our life. Okay, a few more points. Oh yeah, I brought this back because, and Kelsey mentioned this morning in her keynote, but again, because I had that example of New Zealand, just wanted to refer back to the Wanganui River, where that river has been granted the same rights as humans, and I like this quote from Gerald Albert, who's one of the lead negotiators in that case, and just kind of speaks to the Indigenous perspective of treating the river as a living entity and how that is the correct approach. It is an indivisible whole instead of the traditional model of treating it from the perspective of ownership and management. So I like that example of how we might reimagine how we interact and how we create legal structures that support the integrity of rivers and waters on their own. The next is to amplify and protect the voices of Indigenous water protectors and land defenders. Indigenous communities, and in particular Indigenous women, offer perspectives on water protection and resource extraction that are often not heard or understood, and especially in the context of evaluating new resources projects and understanding their impacts on communities. And this research or this knowledge fills a sizable knowledge gap in the context of understanding community well-being and the impacts over time that resource projects can have. So it really is an important part of decolonization, is not only that incorporation of Indigenous knowledge, but amplifying these voices in spaces where they normally aren't heard. And I was grateful to hear from Dr. Kelsey Leonard during the keynote this morning for that reason. She also spoke to this as well about how land defenders and water protectors are perceived as threats, in particular women, because they jeopardize that colonial structure and for women jeopardize that gender power structure as well. And the protection of these voices is deeply needed because they routinely kind of and clearly denounce how harmful it is for humanity to continue supporting a system that permanently exploits life on the planet. And that is a message that many want to shut down. Women are on the front lines of kind of experiencing the impacts of those projects, and in that they carry those roles as caregivers and water protectors. So they see the impacts firsthand, but they are also the ones who have the knowledge to voice change. And during the pandemic, but not only during the pandemic, before too, land defenders and water protectors are at risk of violence, and this has been an increased risk of violence during the pandemic. So it is important for us to protect those voices as well as amplify. And I'm going to end with the last point on reconnecting with the watershed. This is a photo of the burnt river in Ontario, and was a moment for me of deep renewal to be in that space. This is a few years ago now. But I'll return to that quote by Denise Nadeau that I shared at the beginning. If people feel a relational connection to the watershed in which they live, it is easier for them to act in an embodied way upon their responsibilities. So reconnecting and knowing our watersheds, going into our watersheds for recreation, contemplation, spiritual practice, or retreat. This all stimulates affection that nurtures our willingness to protect and act. And that is just an important role in seeking water justice. Living into right relations, this is an important connection because of that inherent connection in Indigenous peoples, that their ethical and moral sphere of life extends beyond humans into ecosystems and our natural environments. And living into right relations mandates us to both do so with people and with the land. So I wanted to end with that, in that we are called in water justice to to seek that that right relation with water and with the land, as well as with people. And Wasekam spoke, you know, of that disconnection and of that those relationships in his address this morning, and acknowledging the water within and the water that unites us all. And so I think that that is an important place for us to kind of end on and to contemplate on in this work. So I am going to end there. And oh, I just realized that my window got shared. I'm going to end there. We have about 4 minutes left in this session, and I'm just wondering if there was any questions that I can help answer in these last few minutes, or any comments that you'd like to share. I would be happy to hear them and interact with you in these last few minutes. Thank you, everyone, for joining and for being here. Thanks, Melanie. And thank you for that comment on the photo contest. I'm going to check that out. Yes, what a great opportunity to reconnect with the watershed tomorrow on World Rivers Day. Thank you, Harmony and Jean. I'm going to, you can see that on the last slide is information about Kairos, but if you want to visit our website, I'm sharing the website in the chat, and I will also share my email with you there as well. Thanks, Paul. Yes, we are all actors in decolonization. So we can all take up the charge. Yeah, feel free to email me if any of those maps or slides are of interest to you to share. I'd be happy to connect you with those. Yes, the watershed map, if it was the one referring to the Oceanic Watersheds, is from Canadian Geographic. And the Ojibwe and Haudenosaunee maps of the Great Lakes are from the Decolonial Atlas. Now I can share with you. As the link to the Ojibwe map, at least. Yes, yeah. Paul shared a great link about honoring the lands and waters. Big piece about land acknowledgement. Yes, so the it's helpful too. I can put those in the chat, those 6 points. The chat doesn't let me make a nice list, but I'm going to try and share them with you. Okay. So to repudiate racist policies and legislation, reclaim maps and Indigenous. claims, uphold and respect Indigenous rights and title, incorporate Indigenous knowledge alongside Western science and governance, amplify the voices of Indigenous water protectors and land defenders, and reconnect with the watershed. Here. I have to separate at least with numbers so that you can make sense of that list.